The envelope appeared in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in October, and I almost threw it away. It had no postage, no return address, just my name written in handwriting that made my stomach do a strange flip. It was my handwriting. Not exactly. There were subtle differences in the letter forms, a slight looseness to the penmanship that suggested either a different person trying to mimic my style or the same person writing with a different hand, a different intention, a different emotional state. But it was undeniably familiar in the way that only your own handwriting can be familiar. I stood in my apartment with the envelope in one hand and my coffee in the other, staring at my name written in what appeared to be my own writing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Someone had played a prank on me. Someone had spent the time to study my handwriting and replicate it well enough to fool me in the moment. Except that didn't make sense. I'd only been in this apartment for 3 months. I didn't know anyone in this city well enough to know my handwriting, let alone study it and copy it. My hands shook slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, written on both sides in the same hand. The date at the top read, October 15th, 2034. I was standing in 2024. The date on the letter was exactly 10 years in the future. My first instinct was to laugh. This was clearly some kind of elaborate joke. Someone was pranking me, and I had to admit it was creative. But as I began to read the letter, my laughter died in my throat. "Dear Rebecca," it began. "I'm writing this letter 10 years before you receive it. I know that doesn't make sense. I know that the laws of physics don't allow for this kind of communication. And yet, here I am doing it anyway. If you're reading this, then it worked. If you're reading this, then the impossible is actually possible, and we have a lot to talk about. First, I want you to know that I'm okay. More than okay, actually. I'm writing this from a place of happiness and stability and peace that I haven't experienced yet in your present moment. I know you're struggling right now. I know you're questioning whether you made the right choice moving to this city. I know you're wondering if taking that job was a mistake, if leaving behind everything familiar was worth it, if you're going to regret it for the rest of your life. I'm writing to tell you that you won't. That the person you're going to become, the person you are, from my perspective, is someone you'll be proud of. But the path to getting there is going to be harder than you imagine. Harder and more beautiful and more transformative than anything you could plan for. I'm writing this letter because I need you to know something that I couldn't have known when I was you. I need you to know that the small choices you make in the next 10 years matter more than you think. That the person you're about to meet, the one who will change everything, is already closer than you realize. That the thing you're most afraid of is actually the thing that's going to save your life. But I can't tell you what that thing is, because if I tell you, if I interfere with the timeline in that way, I might unmake everything good that's coming. So instead, I'm writing this to ask you to trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Trust the version of you that exists 10 years from now, who has lived through everything and come out the other side whole. Trust that even when things feel impossible, even when you want to give up, even when you can't see the path forward, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The letter went on for several more paragraphs, but I couldn't focus on the words anymore. My mind was racing with the implications. This was impossible, but I was holding tangible proof of something impossible. This was a prank, but I couldn't imagine how anyone could have orchestrated something this elaborate, this detailed, this personally specific. This was a delusion, but I was clearly awake and in my right mind and holding a physical object. I read the letter 3 times. Each time, I caught new details that seemed to confirm that this was genuinely from me. It referenced the specific layout of my apartment in a way that only I would know. It mentioned the exact conversation I'd had with my mother on the phone the night before, a conversation that no one else had heard. It brought up a memory from when I was 7 years old, something I'd never told anyone, something I'd barely let myself think about in decades. By the time I finished reading it the 3rd time, I was crying. Not from fear, though there was fear. Not from confusion, though there was certainly confusion, but from a deep sense of recognition. I knew somehow that this letter was real, that I had written it, that my future self had somehow found a way to reach back across a decade and touch my present self. And if that was true, then everything else was true too. I was going to be okay, more than okay. The small desperate hope I'd been clinging to since I moved to this city, the hope that maybe I'd made the right choice, that maybe this fresh start would actually work out, wasn't baseless. It was a premonition. My future self had come back to tell me that hope was warranted, that I should keep going, that things were going to get better, I set the letter down on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to read it again, to extract more clues, to try to figure out what was coming, what the impossible thing was, who the person was who would change everything. But another part of me understood that the letter had given me exactly what I needed: permission to stop being afraid. Permission to stop second-guessing my choices. Permission to trust myself. And maybe that was the real magic of the letter. Not that it had come from the future, though that was remarkable, but that it had given me what everyone needs sometimes: validation that I was going to be okay. For the next week, I told no one about the letter. I didn't tell my mother, who would have suggested I see a therapist. I didn't tell my coworkers, who would have thought I was unstable. I didn't tell anyone because I somehow understood, instinctively, that the letter was meant to be private. That it was a communication between me and myself across time, and introducing other people into that conversation would somehow dilute its power. But I read it constantly. I read it before work in the mornings. I read it during lunch breaks. I read it before bed at night. I must have read it 20 times that first week, and each time I read it, I noticed something new. A phrase that seemed to have hidden meaning. A reference that I almost understood but not quite. It was like the letter was a puzzle, and my future self had hidden clues inside it, breadcrumbs for me to follow. On the 8th day, I made a decision. If my future self had gone to the trouble of sending me a letter, then she must have had a reason. She must have needed me to do something, to make certain choices, to move in a particular direction. And if that was the case, then I needed to pay attention to the subtle guidance the letter was providing. The letter mentioned that the person who would change everything was already closer than I realized. I thought about the people in my life, my coworkers at the marketing firm where I'd taken a job, the neighbors in my apartment building, the people at the coffee shop I visited every morning, the employees at the gym I just joined. Who was this person? And how close were they? The letter also mentioned that the thing I was most afraid of was the thing that would save my life. What was I most afraid of? That was easier to answer. I was afraid of abandonment. I was afraid of making the wrong choice and ending up alone. I was afraid of not being good enough, smart enough, successful enough. I was afraid that I'd moved to this new city, left behind my stable job and my comfortable life, and made the biggest mistake of my life. The letter seemed to suggest that this fear was misplaced, that the very thing I was running from was actually my salvation. I didn't understand how that could be possible, but I decided to trust it anyway. That week at work, I made a point of talking to people I usually avoided. I sat with a coworker named James at lunch instead of eating alone at my desk. I accepted an invitation from a woman named Patricia to go to happy hour after work. I volunteered to work on a project with someone I'd never interacted with before, and I started paying attention to see if any of these people felt like the person my future self had warned me about, but none of them did. They were nice enough, but they didn't trigger any sense of recognition, any feeling that they were significant in any way. By the end of the week, I was frustrated. My future self had been cryptic on purpose, I understood that, but it felt like I was chasing shadows, trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. On Saturday, I did something spontaneous. I decided to take a different route to the coffee shop. Instead of walking down my usual street, I cut through an alley I'd never noticed before. And that's where I met him. He was struggling with a bicycle that had gotten stuck against a brick wall, apparently trying to get it free without causing damage to either the wall or the bike. He was frustrated, muttering to himself, not noticing me until I'd practically walked into him. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, jumping back and nearly tripping over his own feet. He caught himself at the last moment, and we both burst out laughing at the absurdity of it. His name was Marcus. He was new to the city, too, had moved here 6 months ago to pursue a master's degree in environmental science. He was ridiculously kind, making jokes about his clumsiness and apologizing for blocking the alley. We talked for 20 minutes, and when we parted ways, he asked if he'd see me around. There was something in the way he asked it that made me think he meant it more than casual politeness. Over the next few weeks, I kept running into Marcus. Not by accident, I eventually realized, but by design. I started taking that same route through the alley every day, hoping he'd be there. And he usually was, or we'd see each other at the coffee shop, or he'd show up at the gym. It was like the universe was conspiring to keep throwing us together until we couldn't ignore the significance of it. By December, we were dating. By January, I knew I was falling in love with him. And by February, I understood what my future self's letter had meant. Marcus wasn't the person who would change everything, or rather, he was part of it, but not all of it. The real change was happening inside me. Through my relationship with Marcus, through the vulnerability it required, through the risk of opening myself up to another person after I'd spent so long protecting myself from the possibility of abandonment, I was becoming someone new. I was becoming the person my future self had written to. The person who was happy and stable and at peace. "What made you move here?" Marcus asked me one night as we were lying in bed, the city lights filtering through the window and painting patterns on the ceiling. I thought about the letter. I thought about my future self, 10 years from now, looking back on this moment. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I just had this feeling that I needed to, that something was waiting for me here, that if I didn't take the risk, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." Marcus rolled over and looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made me feel like he understood. Like he knew, somehow, that this conversation was about more than just my relocation. "I'm glad you did," he said. "I'm glad you're here." I was glad, too, more than he could possibly know. Over the next 2 years, I kept the letter hidden in a drawer in my nightstand. I never showed it to Marcus, though I came close many times. There was something about it that felt sacred, private, like it was a conversation between me and my future self that shouldn't be interrupted by anyone else's skepticism or wonder. But I thought about it constantly. I reread it at pivotal moments in my relationship with Marcus. When he asked me to move in with him, I reread it. When we talked about our futures, I reread it. When I quit my job at the marketing firm and started my own consulting business, I reread it. And each time I reread it, I noticed something new. The letter had been careful not to promise anything. It hadn't said that Marcus and I would work out forever. It hadn't said that my business would be successful. It hadn't given me any specific guarantees about the next 10 years. It had only said that I would be okay, that I would be happy, that I would be at peace. And maybe that was the point. Maybe my future self had known that if she'd tried to blueprint my life, if she'd told me exactly what would happen, I would have resisted. I would have tried to follow her instructions too rigidly or rebelled against them out of fear. By keeping the letter vague, by giving me just enough guidance to point me in the right direction but not enough to determine my path, she'd given me the freedom to become myself. Around the 3-year mark, I started to wonder about the mechanics of the letter. How had my future self sent it back to me? What principle of physics or quantum mechanics or dimensional theory could possibly explain how a letter written 10 years in the future could arrive in my past? I started researching. I looked into articles about time travel, about closed time-like curves, about the grandfather paradox. I looked into quantum entanglement and the many worlds interpretation and everything else I could find that might explain what had happened. But the more I learned, the more I realized that none of it explained the letter. Because the letter wasn't just a physical object. It was a message. And messages, by definition, require intent. They require someone to have chosen to send them. My future self had deliberately sent this letter back to me, which meant that somehow, in the year 2034, she had found a way to communicate across time. And if she could do that, if that was possible, then what else was possible? Around the same time that I was having these philosophical crises, I discovered that I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it was welcome. Marcus and I had talked about children, but we'd been taking our time, enjoying just the two of us. But when I found out I was going to be a parent, everything shifted. Suddenly, the future felt real in a way it hadn't before. Suddenly, I wasn't just thinking about my own life. I was thinking about the life I would be creating, the person I would be responsible for, the legacy I would be leaving behind. I thought about the letter differently after that. I thought about what it would mean to reach back to my past self from a future that included this child. I thought about whether my future self, the one writing from 2034, had known about this pregnancy when she wrote the letter. And if she had known, what else did she know? About my daughter or son, about my marriage to Marcus, about all the choices I would make over the next 10 years. One night, when I was about 7 months pregnant, I took the letter out and read it again. And this time, I saw something I'd never noticed before. A sentence near the end, hidden among other phrases. "You will have a choice to make. It will feel like the biggest choice of your life. When that moment comes, trust yourself. Trust what you feel in your heart, not what society tells you to feel." I'd read that sentence dozens of times before, but I'd never really focused on it. Now, with my hand resting on my swollen belly, I wondered if this choice had something to do with my pregnancy. Was my future self trying to tell me something? Was there something I needed to decide? I brought it up with my therapist, Dr. Morrison, during our next session. I didn't tell her about the letter from the future. I knew how that would sound. But I asked her generally about big choices, about the ways that motherhood was supposed to change a person, about whether I was making the right decision. "What does your gut tell you?" Dr. Morrison asked, in the way that therapists do. "My gut tells me that I'm terrified," I said honestly. "My gut tells me that I don't know if I'm ready. My gut tells me that once I have this baby, my life is never going to be the same." "That's all true," Dr. Morrison said. "But is it true in a bad way?" I thought about that question for a long moment. "No," I finally said. "It's true in a way that feels necessary. It feels like something that needs to happen, like I'm supposed to become a mother." "Then that's your answer," Dr. Morrison said, and I understood that she was right. The choice that had felt so overwhelming, so terrifying, was actually clear once I allowed myself to feel my own truth instead of listening to all the voices, internal and external, telling me to be afraid. My daughter was born on a cold day in March. We named her Sophie. And the moment I saw her, the moment they placed her on my chest and I felt her weight, her realness, her incredible vulnerability, I understood something about the letter. My future self had known that this was coming. She had known that I would become a mother, and she had known that I was afraid of it. So she'd sent the letter to me at the moment when I was most vulnerable, most uncertain, most in need of reassurance. She'd sent it to me to make sure that I wouldn't let fear make me smaller, that I wouldn't let doubt paralyze me, that I would take the leap and become the person I was meant to become. Looking at my daughter's tiny face, I wondered what choice she would face when she was in her 20s. What letter would she need to receive from her own future self? And I made a private vow that I would raise her in such a way that she wouldn't need a letter, that I would teach her to trust herself, that I would help her become the kind of person who is brave enough to live her own life without needing reassurance from the future. But I also understood that sometimes, even the bravest people need a sign from the universe. Sometimes, even the strongest people need to know that they're going to be okay. And I was grateful, so profoundly grateful, that my future self had loved me enough to send that sign back across the years. 5 years after receiving the letter, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was organizing my office. I'd expanded my consulting business significantly and now had a small team working for me when I found a book wedged behind some files. It was a journal, leather-bound, with no label on the outside. I almost threw it away, assuming it was old work notes or something equally unimportant, but something made me open it. And when I did, I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my handwriting. Older, more assured than the handwriting in the letter, but unmistakably mine. The first entry was dated October 14th, 2034. One day before the letter was dated. I sat down in my chair and started reading. This was my journal from 10 years in the future. My future self had written down, day by day, the months leading up to sending the letter back to me. And what I read was extraordinary. My future self, 54-year-old me, had spent the last 5 years before sending the letter developing a method to communicate with my past. She'd worked with physicists and engineers and philosophers, studying everything from quantum entanglement to dimensional theory. She'd eventually found a way to create a kind of temporal bridge, a space outside of normal time where a message could exist, waiting to be discovered. She had spent years perfecting the technique, countless failed attempts that had left her exhausted and discouraged. But she had persisted because she had known that she needed to send that letter. She needed to reach back and save my life. The journal entries were heartbreaking. They described moments when she wanted to give up, when she thought the whole thing was impossible and she was wasting her time. But she also described the moments of hope, the moments when she felt she was close to breakthrough. And most importantly, she described why she needed to do it. In entry after entry, she wrote about the woman I had become if she hadn't sent the letter, about the timeline where I had let fear paralyze me, where I had gone back to my hometown, back to my old job, back to the safe but suffocating life I'd been living before. She wrote about a version of me that had never met Marcus, never had Sophie, never started the consulting business that had become so fulfilling. She wrote about a version of me that had lived a life of quiet desperation, wondering always what might have been if I'd been braver. And she had been determined not to let that timeline become real. So she had worked tirelessly to find a way to reach back and save me, to give me the reassurance I needed to keep going, to make sure that I chose the path that led to happiness instead of the path that led to regret. As I read deeper into the journal, I learned that sending the letter backward through time had had consequences. My future self had written about how the act of temporal communication had left her exhausted in ways she couldn't quite explain, how it had aged her, how it had affected her in ways that she was still trying to understand. But she had done it anyway because she loved me. Because I was her, and saving me meant everything. I finished reading the journal with tears streaming down my face. I was sitting alone in my office, and I felt like I was sitting across from my own future self, having a conversation that spanned decades. I understood now that the letter hadn't been random. It hadn't been a prank or a delusion. It had been a gift. A precious gift that my future self had sacrificed years of her life to give me. And I made another vow in that moment. I would do everything in my power to honor that gift. I would live the best life I possibly could. I would make sure that the choices my future self had guided me toward actually led to happiness and fulfillment. I would become the person she had envisioned me becoming. I put the journal down and immediately pulled out my laptop. If my future self could reach back across time to save me, then maybe I could reach forward into the future to thank her. I wasn't a physicist. I didn't have access to the research that future me had apparently developed. But maybe I didn't need to. Maybe I could just write a letter. Maybe I could just speak into the void and trust that somehow, across the impossible distance of time, my words would reach her. So I wrote. I wrote about everything I'd accomplished since receiving her letter. I wrote about Sophie, about how incredible she was, about how much I loved being her mother. I wrote about my marriage to Marcus, about the stability and joy that our relationship had brought into my life. I wrote about my business, about how fulfilling it was to help other people and companies grow. I wrote about the ways that receiving her letter had changed the trajectory of my entire life. And I wrote about the future, about what I hoped I would become by the time I was 54 years old, about my dreams for Sophie, about the life I wanted to build with Marcus, about the legacy I wanted to leave behind. When I was done writing, I had no idea what to do with the letter. I couldn't send it through the mail. I couldn't email it. There was no delivery system for a message meant for my future self 10 years from now. So I did what seemed most logical. I put it in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the outside, "To Rebecca, October 15th, 2034. And then I put it in a drawer in my nightstand, right next to the letter I'd received from myself 10 years before. And I waited. I knew I would have to wait 10 years to see if the letter made it to my future self. I knew that I might never know if it worked. But I had faith. I had faith because my future self had already proven that it was possible. She had already shown me that love was more powerful than physics. That the human will to save someone you love, even if that someone is your own past self, could transcend the normal rules of reality. The next 5 years passed in a blur of normalcy. I lived my life. I raised Sophie, who grew from an infant into a curious, intelligent, beautiful 5-year-old. I continued to build my consulting business. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony in the mountains. We talked about having another child but kept delaying it, both of us content with our family of 3. And I waited. I thought about the letter I'd written to my future self. I wondered if it was actually going to reach her. I wondered if the mechanism that had allowed the first letter to reach me backward through time could work in reverse. My rational mind told me it was all impossible. That the first letter had been some kind of shared delusion, or a prank so elaborate that I'd never figured out who was behind it, or some other explanation that didn't require me to accept that the laws of physics could be bent. But my intuitive mind, the part of me that had learned to trust itself over the past 5 years, knew better. It knew that the letter had been real, and it knew that my letter to the future would be real too. Around the 5-year mark, something unexpected happened. I received a message from a physicist named Dr. Alina Vasquez. She'd read some of my business writing. I'd started publishing articles about innovation and courage in the face of uncertainty, and she wanted to meet with me. When we finally met for coffee, she got straight to the point. "I've been studying temporal anomalies for the last decade," she said without preamble, "and I've come across something remarkable. There's evidence of a temporal bridge that was created sometime in the late 2020s. A mechanism that allowed communication across a 10-year gap, and I have strong reason to believe that someone used it to send a message backward through time, to the year 2024. I stared at her, not sure if I was allowed to breathe. How is that possible? I managed to ask. According to the math, it shouldn't be, Dr. Vasquez said. But the evidence is there. The temporal bridge exists. It was activated once exactly 10 years ago, and then it was never activated again. I've been trying to figure out who built it and why. And when I read your articles, when I learned about your background, I had a hypothesis. I think you were the recipient of that message, Rebecca. I think someone sent you a letter from the future. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only sit there staring at this stranger, this scientist who was describing the impossible thing that had happened to me as if it were an established fact. I received a letter, I finally whispered. From myself, dated 10 years in the future. I thought I was hallucinating. I thought I was going crazy. But you're saying it's real? You're saying it actually happened. I'm saying that based on the evidence, something temporal occurred 10 years ago that shouldn't have been able to occur, Dr. Vasquez said carefully. I'm saying that someone built a temporal bridge and activated it once, and then they deactivated it and destroyed the research behind it. Whoever did that went to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret, to keep it hidden, to make sure no one else could replicate what they'd done. I thought about my future self, 10 years ahead, working tirelessly to build this bridge, sacrificing her time and her energy to reach back and save me. If someone had a second message to send, I said slowly, would your bridge still work? Would it be possible to send something back the other direction? Dr. Vasquez's eyes widened slightly. You have a message, she said. It wasn't a question. I have a letter, I confirmed. I wrote it 5 years ago. I put it in a drawer, and I've been waiting to see if it would reach the person I wrote it for. Give it to me, Dr. Vasquez said. I think I can help you. She explained that she'd spent the last several years reverse engineering the temporal bridge based on the evidence of its existence. She thought she'd figured out how it worked. She thought she could activate it again, at least once more, to send a message in the opposite direction. She warned me that it might not work. She warned me that the temporal bridge might have been permanently disabled to prevent it from being used again. But she was willing to try. Over the next few months, I worked with Dr. Vasquez and a team of researchers. We never published anything. We never told anyone what we were doing. But we worked together to prepare my letter for temporal transmission. Dr. Vasquez explained to me the theory behind how it would work. My letter would exist in the temporal bridge, suspended outside of normal time, until the moment when my future self reached out to retrieve it. Just as I had reached out and found the letter my future self had sent to me. It would be a kind of connection across time, a moment of intersection between my present and my future. On October 14th, 2034, exactly 10 years after I'd written the letter, Dr. Vasquez called me. It's ready, she said. Are you sure you want to do this? I thought about my future self, waiting for this message, hoping I would eventually figure out how to reach her. I thought about the life I'd built since receiving her letter. I thought about Sophie and Marcus and everything I'd become. Yes, I said. I'm sure. We activated the bridge at midnight. I placed my letter in a special chamber that Dr. Vasquez had designed, and we initiated the temporal transmission. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a sound, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And the letter disappeared, just vanished from the chamber as if it had never existed. My future self had received it. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if my letter would change my future. I didn't know if receiving my response would alter the timeline for my future self in some significant way. All I knew was that I'd done my part. I'd reached across the impossible distance and touched the person I would become. After the transmission, Dr. Vasquez and I agreed to cease all temporal communication research. We destroyed the notes. We sealed away the equipment. We made a pact of silence, knowing that the knowledge of how to manipulate time itself was too dangerous to let exist in the world. But I kept the journal that my future self had left behind. I kept the letter that had started everything. And I added my letter to the drawer, or at least, I waited for the day when I would receive my future self's letter back to me, telling me that my letter had reached her. That day came on October 15th, 2044, exactly 20 years after my future self had first sent me the letter that changed my life. It appeared in my mailbox the same way the first letter had appeared. No postage, no return address. Just my name in handwriting that was now starting to show the age that came with living through 4 decades. I opened it with hands that weren't shaking as much as they had shaken 20 years before. I was older now, I was calmer. But I was also desperate to know if my letter had reached her, if my future self had received my response, if the circle had been completed. The letter read, "My dearest Rebecca, I received your letter. It arrived on October 14th, 2034, and I wept when I read it. I wept because my sacrifice had meant something. I wept because you had become everything I'd hoped you would become. I wept because you loved me enough to try to reach me across time, just as I loved you enough to reach back and save you. Reading your letter was the most profound moment of my life. To know that the future I had been working toward, the future I had endured so much to create, was actually coming to pass. To know that you had built a beautiful life, that you had married Marcus and raised Sophie and created a business that helped people. To know that the young, frightened version of myself that I was trying to save had become not just okay, but genuinely happy. That was worth every sacrifice I made. But I'm writing this letter now, from October 2034, to tell you something that I've only just realized. The person who receives this letter, who will receive this letter, will not be me, because I have made a choice. After you receive this letter, after we complete our circle of communication across time, I am going to take steps to ensure that the timeline you came from ceases to exist. I am going to use the temporal bridge to collapse the version of myself that sent the first letter back to you. I am going to sacrifice myself so that the loop closes, so that there's no paradox, so that the universe doesn't tear itself apart trying to accommodate the impossible thing that we've done. I know this sounds dramatic. I know it sounds like I'm choosing to commit suicide across time, but I'm not. I'm choosing to merge my consciousness with yours. When I deactivate the temporal bridge and collapse my timeline, I won't disappear. I'll merge with you. I'll become part of you. And from that moment forward, you won't just have my wisdom and my guidance. You'll have my memories. You'll have my perspective. You'll be more fully yourself because you'll be yourself plus me. And I'm okay with that. More than okay. I'm honored to become part of you. I'm honored to merge with the version of myself that took the leap of faith and became something beautiful. Take care of Sophie. Take care of Marcus. Take care of the life we've built together. And know that every moment of your future is a moment of mine as well. We are no longer separate. We are one. Forever, Rebecca. I finished reading the letter and I felt something shift inside me. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of my skull, a warmth spreading through my chest. And then, gradually, memories that weren't mine began to surface. I remembered things I'd never experienced. I remembered the laboratory where Dr. Vasquez and I, my future self and Dr. Vasquez, had built the temporal bridge. I remembered the late nights spent calculating equations that seemed to rewrite the laws of physics. I remembered the moment of breakthrough, when the impossible suddenly became possible. I remembered the exhaustion, the doubt, the fear that I was wasting my life on a dream that would never come to fruition. But I also remembered the determination, the absolute certainty that I had to reach back and save myself. And I understood now that this had been my future self's plan all along. This was the real reason she had sent the first letter, not just to save me, but to create a loop, a perfect circle of love and sacrifice that would allow us to merge, to become whole, to be more than we could ever be separately. I pressed my hand to my heart and I felt it. The presence of my future self, no longer separate but integrated into my very being. I thought about what Dr. Elena Vasquez had told me about the temporal bridge being activated once. But there had actually been two activations, once sending the letter backward, and once collapsing the timeline so the loop could close. And now, the bridge was gone. My future self had destroyed it from within, using its own destruction as the mechanism for our merger. She had thought it through completely. She had calculated every variable. She had sacrificed everything to make sure that I would succeed, that we would succeed. I cried that night. I cried for the person I'd been before receiving the letter. I cried for the person my future self had been, sacrificing herself to save me. I cried for the beautiful, terrible, impossible love that transcended time itself. Marcus found me on the couch, tears streaming down my face, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He just held me. And in that moment, I felt my future self holding me too. Two versions of myself, merged into one consciousness, finding solace in the love of one good man who'd agreed to love me despite all my complications and mysteries. The next morning, I sat down and I wrote an account of everything that had happened. I wrote about the letter from my future self. I wrote about Dr. Vasquez and the temporal bridge. I wrote about sending my own letter back through time. I wrote about the moment of merger, when my future self integrated into my present consciousness. I sealed the account in an envelope and I locked it away. I didn't know if I would ever share this story. I didn't know if anyone would believe it. But I knew that I needed to record it. I needed to leave evidence that the impossible had happened. That two versions of myself had found a way to love each other across time. That consciousness and sacrifice and determination could transcend the normal rules of reality. Years continued to pass. Sophie grew up. She was brilliant like both of her parents, driven and curious and kind. I wondered sometimes if she could sense the merger that had happened inside me. If she could feel the presence of her future grandmother, my merged future self, within her mother's consciousness. I never told her the full story. I wasn't sure she'd believe it, but I taught her to trust her instincts. I taught her to be brave even when she was afraid. I taught her that the most important relationships are the ones that span across impossible distances and teach us about ourselves. And I lived my life fully, knowing that I was living it for two people now. Marcus and I built a good marriage. Not perfect, but real and honest and grounded in genuine love. My consulting business grew. I helped hundreds of people and companies achieve their potential. I became known as someone who understood transformation, someone who understood what it took to save yourself. And I was grateful every single day for the letter that had arrived in my mailbox 24 years before. The letter that had changed my timeline. The letter that had taught me that love could transcend time itself. The letter from myself, written by the person I would become, sent back to save the person I'd been. When I turned 54 years old, I did something I hadn't done since my future self had merged with me. I took out the envelope with the letter I'd written to October 2034, the letter that my future self said she'd received, and I opened it. I read the words I'd written 24 years before, the words that had somehow reached my future self and convinced her that our sacrifice was worth it. And I understood the final truth. There was no paradox. There was no timeline that existed and didn't exist simultaneously. There was only this: love and sacrifice and the human will to save ourselves from despair, no matter what it cost. My future self had saved me by reaching back across time. And I had validated that sacrifice by living a life worthy of the gift she'd given me. We had saved each other across the impossible distance of 10 years. And in doing so, we had become one. Whole, complete, forever connected by the threads of time and love that bind us to ourselves across eternity. The letters sit in my drawer now, all of them. The letter that started the journey. The letter I sent to my future self. The journal from my future self describing the process of creating the temporal bridge. The letter about the merger. They are the evidence that something extraordinary happened. That the laws of physics can be bent by the power of love. That we are never truly separate from ourselves, no matter how far into the future we travel. And sometimes, when I'm having a difficult day, when I'm not sure if I'm making the right choices, when I'm afraid of what comes next, I read those letters. And I feel her, my future self, my merged self, the person I will become. And I know that I'm going to be okay, because I've already seen my future, and it's beautiful.